The early morning sky over Seattle was streaked with hues of pink and gold, the city's iconic Space Needle rising like a beacon against the vibrant canvas. Abram Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks as he gazed out from the top-floor window of Whitmore Technologies headquarters. His private helicopter waited on the helipad, rotors already spinning, ready to whisk him away to finalize the deal of a lifetime. The merger with Harper Innovations would solidify Whitmore Technologies as the most influential tech conglomerate on the West Coast. Abram's tailored suit clung to his tall frame, a perfect metaphor for the persona he had built, sharp, imposing, and untouchable. To his employees, Abram was a genius innovator and a demanding leader. To his rivals, he was a force of nature, feared and respected in equal measure. Yet, as he turned from the view, the faintest shadow of weariness clouded his steel-grey eyes. "Mr. Whitmore, the chopper is ready," his assistant, Sheila, informed him, her voice clipped and professional. "Thank you," Abram replied, his voice cool and detached. He walked briskly to the elevator, stepping into the private car that would take him to the rooftop. His mind was already on the upcoming negotiations, the potential pitfalls, and the billions of dollars at stake. Each decision felt like a move in an endless chess game, and Abram never played to lose. Meanwhile, miles away in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, Alora Flores tied her dark hair into a neat bun, her movements precise and practiced. The quiet hum of her apartment was broken only by the occasional cough from her son, Eric, who was still curled up on the couch with his favorite blanket. "Don't worry, mijo," Alora murmured, crouching to kiss his forehead. "I'll bring medicine home after work." Eric's big brown eyes, a mirror of her own, blinked up at her with trust that tightened her chest. Being both mother and provider wasn't easy, but Alora had long accepted that her life was a series of compromises. She shouldered her bag, the familiar weight of responsibility settling as she closed the door behind her. Alora's job as a housekeeper at the sprawling Whitmore estate was steady work, even if it often left her feeling invisible. As she boarded the bus that would take her across town, she allowed herself a moment of escape, imagining a world where she didn't have to choose between time with Eric and paying the bills. At the same time, Abram's helicopter lifted into the Seattle sky, cutting through the brisk morning air. The hum of its engine was a comforting rhythm, familiar after years of similar trips. Yet, halfway across the bay, an alarming jolt shook the chopper. Lights flashed on the console, and the pilot's voice crackled urgently over the intercom. "Mr. Whitmore, we have a problem." The words were lost in the chaos as the helicopter pitched violently to one side. Abram gripped the seat's armrest as a thunderous roar filled his ears. Then came the sensation of falling, and everything went black. Abram's world was a void of darkness and silence, interrupted only by the faintest echoes of memory, voices murmuring, the distant hum of machinery. When he finally stirred, the first sensation was pain. A sharp, relentless ache radiated through his limbs, and his head throbbed as if a hammer pounded inside his skull. Blinking against the harsh overhead lights, he struggled to focus on the figure standing nearby. "You're awake," a calm, clinical voice stated. It belonged to a middle-aged nurse who watched him with a mix of relief and curiosity. "You're at Seattle General Hospital. You were in a helicopter crash." Abram attempted to speak, but his throat was dry, the words catching before they could form. He lifted a trembling hand to his temple, only to find it bandaged. The nurse stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You were lucky," she continued, her voice softening. "The pilot didn't make it. Paramedics found you just in time." Abram's brows furrowed as he forced himself to process the information. The crash, the fall, a flicker of memory, the city skyline fading as the ground rushed to meet him. Yet, when he tried to grasp at the details of who he was or why he had been in the helicopter, They slipped away like water through his fingers. Who am I? The question tumbled from his lips, a mix of confusion and fear. The nurse exchanged a quick, uneasy glance with the doctor who had entered the room. "You're Abram Whitmore," she said gently. "The CEO of Whitmore Technologies, a billionaire and—" I don't know that name," Abram interrupted, his voice hoarse. Panic crept into his tone as he shook his head. "I don't know who that is." The doctor stepped forward, his expression calm but serious. "Mr. Whitmore, you've suffered a head injury. It appears you're experiencing retrograde amnesia, memory loss concerning your identity and past. It's not uncommon in cases of severe trauma, but recovery can be unpredictable." Abram sank back into the pillows, his heart racing. The words swirled around him: amnesia, identity, trauma, but none of them anchored him. He was Abram Whitmore, apparently, but what did that mean when the name felt foreign, hollow? Days later, Abram left the hospital under the care of his legal team and was taken to the Whitmore mansion. Yet, despite its grandeur, the sprawling estate did nothing to stir recognition in him. The pristine marble floors, high ceilings, and expensive art were cold and alien. The staff greeted him with practiced deference, their faces blurring into a sea of formality. It was suffocating. Then, in the midst of his disorientation, he met her. Alora Flores had just finished scrubbing the kitchen tiles when she heard a quiet shuffle behind her. Turning, she froze, mop in hand, as she came face to face with the man whose name adorned the estate. But instead of the commanding presence she'd expected, Abram looked lost, his grey eyes shadowed with confusion. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly, his voice low and unsure. I think I live here." Alora blinked, unsure how to respond. This was Abram Whitmore, wasn't it? The stories she'd heard about him painted a picture of confidence and control, but here, standing before her, was a man unmoored. "Yes, sir," she replied cautiously, her tone kind but professional. "This is your home. Is there anything I can do to help?" Abram's lips curved into a small, grateful smile, a fleeting moment of relief in the storm of his uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "But thank you." As Alora watched him retreat down the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this man, her employer, was profoundly, irrevocably different. And neither of them knew it yet, but their worlds were about to collide in ways neither could have imagined. Abram sat in the oversized armchair of his study, the flickering light of the fire casting shadows across the room. Despite the grandeur of his surroundings, he felt like an uninvited guest in someone else's life. The Whitmore mansion, with its polished marble floors and sprawling gardens, was a palace, but it offered no comfort. Every hallway, every painting on the walls, every perfectly arranged piece of furniture was a stark reminder of his lost past. Who was Abram Whitmore? The name echoed in his mind, but no part of it resonated as his own. Downstairs, Alora Flores wiped her hands on her apron, preparing to leave for the day. It had been a long shift, and though she was eager to get home to Eric, she couldn't shake the image of Abram standing in the kitchen earlier, looking both out of place and desperately alone. The man she had briefly interacted with seemed a far cry from the powerful mogul she had heard whispers about among the staff. As she passed through the hallway toward the service exit, she caught sight of him once more, standing near the study's doorway, staring blankly at a stack of books. Something in his posture, rigid yet defeated, stopped her in her tracks. Against her better judgment, she turned back and approached cautiously. "Sir," she said softly, careful not to startle him. Abram turned, his grey eyes meeting hers with a flicker of recognition, not of her, but of her kindness from earlier. "Yes?" he asked, his voice tentative. I just wanted to say if you need anything, the staff is here to help. She hesitated, then added, including me. Abram's brow furrowed as he processed her words. What's your name? Alora, she replied simply. I'm one of the housekeepers. Alora, he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It was the first familiar thing he had encountered since returning home, though he didn't know why. Thank you. I think I could use some help. Alora paused, her hand tightening slightly on the strap of her bag. She wasn't accustomed to being noticed by the residents of the mansion, let alone asked for assistance beyond her assigned duties. But something about the vulnerability in Abram's expression tugged at her. Well, she said slowly, if you're trying to settle back in, maybe start with the basics. I could show you around, help you get reacquainted. Abram nodded, a small but genuine gesture. I'd like that. The next morning, Alora arrived at the mansion earlier than usual, this time prepared for an unusual day. She met Abram in the grand foyer, where he was waiting with the same tentative air. She offered a gentle smile before beginning their informal tour, pointing out the rooms and their purposes as they moved through the vast space. This is the dining hall, she explained, gesturing to the long, elegant table adorned with an unused crystal centerpiece. You used to host a lot of events here, fundraisers, meetings with important people. Abram lingered by the table, running his fingers along the edge. Did I enjoy them? He asked quietly. Alora tilted her head, considering her response. From what I've heard, not really. But you were good at it. Abram chuckled softly, the sound surprising both of them. Good at something I didn't like. Sounds about right. They continued through the mansion, and for the first time, Abram felt a faint sense of connection, not to the building, but to Alora's patient explanations. Each room became less of a mystery and more of a stepping stone toward understanding who he might have been. By mid-afternoon, they found themselves in the garden, a sprawling expanse of manicured hedges, vibrant blooms, and a fountain that shimmered in the sunlight. Alora led Abram to a small stone bench shaded by a weeping willow, its cascading branches swaying gently in the breeze. This used to be your favorite spot, she said, folding her hands in front of her. At least, that's what Mrs. Gray used to say. Gray? Abram asked, the name stirring something faint but elusive in his mind. Your sister, Alora clarified. She doesn't visit often, but when she does, she always mentions how much you used to love sitting here. Said it was the only place you'd let yourself relax. Abram stared at the bench, trying to summon a memory that refused to surface. Instead, all he could feel was the quiet peace of the moment, the sun's warmth, the rustling leaves, and the faint scent of lavender from nearby flower beds. I can't imagine that, he admitted finally, sitting down. Loving a place, I mean. It all feels so disconnected. Alora hesitated before sitting down beside him, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Maybe it's not about remembering what you loved, she said thoughtfully. Maybe it's about finding new things to love, starting fresh. Her words struck a chord in Abram, though he couldn't fully articulate why. Do you think that's possible? He asked, turning to look at her. I think it has to be, she replied, her gaze steady. Otherwise, what's the point? They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fountain's soft trickle filling the space between them. For the first time since waking in the hospital, Abram felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to anchor him, if only for a moment. Later that evening, as Alora gathered her things to leave, she paused in the hallway, glancing back toward the study where Abram had retreated. She could hear faint sounds of movement, the creak of floorboards and the soft rustle of pages. Despite her initial hesitation about getting involved, she found herself silently rooting for him, for the man who seemed lost in his own life, yet determined to find his way. What neither of them knew was that the small steps they had taken together that day would soon ripple outward, pulling them into conflicts and revelations that would test their resolve. Alora had no idea that Abram's sister, Gray, was already planning her arrival with questions of her own. Nor could Abram foresee the dangers lurking within his company, threats orchestrated by people he was supposed to trust. As Alora stepped out into the cool evening air, a subtle but significant shift had begun. Abram was no longer just the man she worked for. He was a man searching for answers, and she had unwittingly become his guide. Calvin Langston's office was a study in controlled chaos, with papers, folders, and financial reports strewn across the mahogany desk. Yet, amidst the clutter, Calvin's focus was razor-sharp. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, as his sharp eyes scanned the room. Across from him sat Corey Harper, the formidable CEO of Harper Innovations, her expression one of cautious calculation. "The merger is in jeopardy," Calvin said bluntly, his tone cold. "Abram's memory loss puts everything we've worked for at risk." Corey's lips twitched in a faint smirk. "Worked for? I thought the Whitmore-Harper deal was Abram's brainchild, not yours." Calvin leaned forward, his gaze hardening. "Abram may have initiated it, but I've ensured its survival. Without me, this deal falls apart." Corey regarded him for a moment, her sharp features betraying little emotion. She was no stranger to power plays, and she knew Calvin's ambitions extended beyond mere survival. "What are you suggesting?" "We expedite the merger," Calvin said, his voice lowering conspiratorially. "Push it through before Abram has a chance to regain control, or worse, his memories. Right now, he's vulnerable, distracted. If we don't act quickly, he could become an obstacle." Corey tapped her manicured fingers on the arm of her chair. She wasn't averse to bold moves, but Calvin's tone suggested a level of risk she wasn't certain she was ready to take. "And what happens if Abram recovers and decides to fight this? He still holds a majority stake in Whitmore Technologies." "That's where you're wrong," Calvin countered, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "I've been quietly consolidating votes within the board. By the time he realizes what's happening, it'll be too late." Corey considered this, her mind racing through the implications. She had no particular loyalty to Abram, but a rushed merger with a company in turmoil could damage her own reputation. "You're walking a fine line, Calvin. If this backfires—" "It won't," he interrupted, his tone final. "This is about ensuring stability for both of our companies." Corey didn't respond immediately, instead rising from her chair and smoothing her tailored suit. "I'll think about it," she said coolly, heading for the door. "Do more than think," Calvin called after her. "Act, before someone else does." Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore mansion, Abram was beginning to piece together fragments of his life, though the process was frustratingly slow. As he stood in the expansive library, flipping through books that seemed both familiar and foreign, he couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing. Alora appeared at the doorway, a hesitant knock breaking his concentration. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice tentative, "I thought you might want to know. Your company's board is holding an emergency meeting tomorrow." Abram frowned, setting the book down. "Why? What's the urgency?" "I don't know," Alora admitted. "But some of the staff were talking. They said Mr. Langston has been making a lot of calls lately. It doesn't sound good." Abram's jaw tightened as he absorbed her words. While his memories were fragmented, his instincts were not. Something about Calvin Langston's name sparked unease in him, a gut feeling he couldn't ignore. "Thank you, Alora," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty brewing inside him. "I'll look into it." Alora nodded, but her concern lingered as she watched him turn back to the library shelves. Something about his posture seemed heavier, as if the weight of the unknown was pressing down on him. What neither of them realized was that Calvin's plan was already in motion, and the board meeting would mark the beginning of a dangerous game that would test Abram's resolve and his ability to trust those around him. The next morning, the Whitmore mansion was eerily quiet as Abram prepared for the meeting. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the cuffs of a crisp white shirt, trying to summon the confidence that seemed to come so naturally to the man he used to be. But the reflection staring back at him was unfamiliar. A stranger wearing the trappings of wealth and power. Alora watched from the hallway, her heart tightening as she saw the tension etched across his face. She had spent enough time around him now to recognize the quiet frustration that simmered beneath his composed exterior. Gathering her courage, she stepped into the room. "Good morning," she began softly, her hands clasped in front of her. Abram turned, his grey eyes meeting hers. "Morning," he replied, his voice steady but distant. "You'll do fine," Alora said, her words carrying more confidence than she felt. "You've been handling everything so far. This meeting is no different." Abram studied her for a moment, the corners of his mouth lifting into a faint smile. "It's strange," he admitted, "to be walking into a room full of people who expect me to lead when I don't even know who I am." "You're still you," Alora said firmly, surprising even herself with the conviction in her voice. "Memory or not, the way you treat people, the decisions you make, they define you, not what you remember." Abram nodded slowly, her words grounding him more than he cared to admit. "Thank you, Alora," he said, his tone sincere, "for everything." Later that morning, Abram entered the towering Whitmore Technologies headquarters, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The boardroom was a stark contrast to the warmth of the mansion's library, cold, clinical, and buzzing with tension. The board members sat around a polished table, their expressions a mix of anticipation and unease. At the head of the table, Calvin Langston stood, his confident demeanor thinly veiling his impatience. "Abram," Calvin greeted, his smile tight. "Glad you could join us." Abram took a seat at the opposite end of the table, his gaze sweeping across the room. Though he didn't recognize most of the faces, he could sense the undercurrents of power dynamics at play. He leaned back slightly, keeping his posture relaxed, but his attention sharp. "Let's get to the point," Calvin continued, his tone smooth but authoritative. "In light of recent circumstances, I believe it's in the company's best interest to reevaluate our leadership structure. As you're all aware, stability is paramount, especially with the Harper merger at stake." Abram's stomach tightened, though he kept his expression neutral. "Are you suggesting I'm incapable of fulfilling my role?" he asked evenly. Calvin spread his hands in a mock gesture of innocence. "Not at all, Abram. But given the uncertainty surrounding your recovery, it's prudent to consider interim measures to ensure confidence among our stakeholders." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Abram's instincts flared, warning him that this was more than just concern for the company. It was a calculated power grab. Before he could respond, the doors to the boardroom opened, and a young woman stepped inside, clutching a folder. Ella Carter, the bright intern Alora had mentioned in passing, hesitated for a brief moment before locking eyes with Abram. "Apologies for the interruption," she said quickly, "but I have something I believe the board needs to see." Calvin's jaw tightened, and his polished mask of control slipped for just a moment. Abram gestured for her to continue, his curiosity piqued. Ella stepped forward, placing the folder on the table and sliding it toward him. Inside were documents, emails, meeting notes, and financial discrepancies, all pointing to Calvin's quiet consolidation of board votes and his backdoor dealings with Corey Harper. Abram's gaze hardened as he flipped through the pages, the pieces of Calvin's plan falling into place. "Interesting," Abram said finally, his voice carrying a calm authority that surprised even himself. He looked up at Calvin, his grey eyes cold. "Care to explain this?" Calvin opened his mouth to respond, but the room erupted into murmurs, the board members exchanging worried glances. For the first time, the balance of power shifted, and Abram felt a flicker of the control he thought he had lost. As the meeting spiraled into debate, Abram realized this was just the beginning. Calvin's maneuvering had been exposed, but the consequences would ripple far beyond the confines of the boardroom. And in the shadows, Corey Harper was still watching, her next move yet to be revealed. Abram stared out of the car window as the cityscape of Seattle unfolded before him. The sleek glass towers of downtown gave way to bustling markets and neighborhoods alive with activity. For the first time since his accident, he was leaving the insular world of the Whitmore mansion, venturing into a part of the city that felt unfamiliar, yet somehow grounding. Alora sat beside him in the back seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had offered to accompany him on this outing, a gesture that Abram had accepted without hesitation. Despite his lingering doubts about his place in the world, he found Alora's presence steadying. She seemed to navigate life with a quiet strength that he envied. "This is Pike Place Market," Alora said, gesturing as the driver pulled into a parking space near the iconic sign. "It's one of the oldest farmers' markets in the country. A lot of locals come here to shop for fresh produce, handmade goods, even flowers." Abram stepped out of the car, the crisp air carrying the mingling scents of fresh bread, salt water, and blooming flowers. The chatter of vendors and customers filled the space, a vibrant symphony of life. He followed Alora as she moved with ease through the crowd, stopping occasionally to admire stalls brimming with colorful produce and artisanal crafts. "Do you come here often?" Abram asked, his curiosity piqued. "Sometimes," Alora admitted, pausing to inspect a display of handmade soaps. "Eric loves the street performers. They always seem to make him laugh, no matter what kind of day he's had." Abram's gaze softened at the mention of her son. Though he had only interacted with Eric briefly, he found himself drawn to the boy's unfiltered joy and curiosity. It was a stark contrast to the carefully constructed world he had once inhabited, a world that now felt hollow. As they wandered further into the market, a man selling bouquets of flowers called out to them. "How about some blooms for the lady?" he asked, his weathered face breaking into a friendly smile. Alora started to wave him off, but Abram stepped forward, surprising them both. "What do you recommend?" he asked, his tone earnest. The vendor studied him for a moment before selecting a small bouquet of lavender and daisies. "Simple, but beautiful," he said, handing it over. Abram turned to Alora, offering the bouquet with a rare smile. "For you," he said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Alora hesitated, her cheeks flushing slightly as she accepted the flowers. "Thank you," she said softly, her fingers brushing against his as she took them. For a moment, the bustling market faded into the background, and they stood in quiet connection. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt significant, a small step towards something neither of them fully understood yet. Their exploration of the market continued, and Abram began to notice the details that made the place special. The laughter of children running between stalls, the care vendors took in arranging their wares, the sense of community that lingered in every interaction. It was a world he had never truly seen before, and it fascinated him. "This feels real," Abram said suddenly, breaking the silence. more real than anything I've experienced in a long time. Alora glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. That's because it is, she replied. This is where people live their lives, without all the noise and complications. Abram nodded, her words settling in his mind like pieces of a puzzle he was beginning to assemble. But even as he embraced the simplicity of the moment, a faint unease lingered. He couldn't ignore the shadow of his past, or the uncertain future waiting for him at Whitmore Technologies. In the crowd, a face briefly caught Abram's attention, a man standing still, watching him intently. Before Abram could react, the figure disappeared into the throng, leaving behind a nagging sense of foreboding that he couldn't quite shake. Abram's gaze lingered on the spot where the figure had stood, his thoughts momentarily clouded by unease. Alora noticed his distraction and gently touched his arm, drawing his attention back. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. He hesitated, unsure how to articulate the strange feeling. "It's nothing," he replied, forcing a small smile. "Just something about being here feels new and unfamiliar." Alora nodded, sensing there was more he wasn't saying, but chose not to press. "Let's head toward the waterfront," she suggested. "The view always helps clear the mind." They made their way down to the pier, where the cool breeze from Puget Sound carried the scent of salt water and freshly caught fish. Families strolled along the boardwalk, and street performers drew small crowds with their acts. Abram stopped near the edge, staring out at the water. The gentle rhythm of the waves lapping against the shore provided a moment of stillness, though his thoughts remained restless. Alora stood beside him, her hands clutching the small bouquet he had given her earlier. She followed his gaze out to the horizon, her own expression thoughtful. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," she said softly. "Sometimes it's enough just to be present." Her words struck a chord in Abram. "It's strange," he said after a pause. "I feel like I've spent my whole life being anywhere but present, always chasing something, success, deals, power, and now that I've lost everything, I'm finally seeing what I missed." Alora turned to him, her eyes searching his face. Maybe losing everything is the only way to find what really matters. Abram considered her words, the honesty in them grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the shrill ring of his phone cut through the air. He frowned, reaching into his pocket to retrieve it. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" "Abram Whitmore," a male voice said on the other end, smooth and deliberate. "I trust you're enjoying your little escape." Abram's spine stiffened, his grip on the phone tightening. "Who is this?" "Let's just say I'm someone who knows how fragile your world really is," the voice continued. "You should watch your back. And your company." The call disconnected before Abram could respond, leaving him holding the phone, his heart pounding. Alora, who had been watching his reaction, stepped closer. "What's wrong?" Abram turned to her, his jaw set, the unease from earlier returning with full force. "I think someone's watching me," he said quietly. "And they're not just watching, they're planning something." Alora's brows furrowed in worry, but her voice was steady. "Then we'll figure it out, together." Her resolve, calm and unwavering, gave Abram a flicker of confidence. But as they left the waterfront and returned to the car, the weight of the unknown pressed heavier on him. The peacefulness of the market and the pier felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the sense that the life he had started to rebuild was already under threat. As they drove back to the mansion, Abram's mind raced with possibilities. Who could be behind the call? Was it Calvin, already taking his next step, or was it someone else entirely? He couldn't be sure, but one thing was certain, The stakes were higher than ever, and he would need to face them head-on if he hoped to protect what little he had left. The sharp sound of coughing jolted Alora awake. She sat up in her modest living room, her heart racing as her eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the lamp she had forgotten to turn off. Across the room, Eric lay curled on the couch, his small frame trembling as another coughing fit overtook him. "Eric!" she murmured, rushing to his side and placing a hand on his forehead. The heat radiating from his skin confirmed her worst fears. His fever had spiked. "It's okay, mijo," she whispered, brushing the damp hair from his face. "I'll take care of you." But her voice wavered with the weight of the reality she faced. She had already missed hours at work to care for him, and though her employer, Mrs. Gray, had always been understanding, Alora couldn't afford to lose any more income. The bills were piling up, and Eric's condition required immediate attention. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Alora made the difficult decision to call her neighbor Maria, a retired nurse who occasionally helped care for Eric when Alora was at work. After explaining the situation, Maria arrived quickly, her kind face etched with concern. "I'll keep an eye on him," Maria assured her, handing Alora a list of over-the-counter remedies to pick up after her shift. "But if his fever doesn't break by tonight, you need to take him to the clinic." Alora nodded, swallowing her guilt as she gathered her things and kissed Eric's forehead. "I'll be back soon, baby," she promised, her voice soft but steady. "You be good for Maria, okay?" Eric's eyes fluttered open briefly, his voice a faint whisper. "Te amo, Mama." The words stayed with Alora as she hurried to the Whitmore mansion, her mind racing with worry. When she arrived, she tried to push her fears aside and focus on her duties, but the weight of Eric's condition was a constant shadow. Midway through the morning, as she dusted the shelves in the library, Abram appeared in the doorway. His usual reserved demeanor softened when he saw the strain in her eyes. "Alora," he began, his tone uncharacteristically gentle, "is everything all right?" Alora hesitated, unused to discussing personal matters with anyone, let alone her employer. But something in Abram's expression, an unspoken empathy, made her feel safe enough to answer. "It's my son, Eric," she admitted quietly. "He's sick, and I'm worried. I'm here because I can't afford not to be, but—" "You should be with him," Abram interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "Family comes first." Alora blinked, startled by his immediate understanding. "I can't just leave. There's work to do and—" "I'll manage," Abram said, surprising them both. "Go, take care of your son, and if there's anything you need, let me know." For a moment, Alora was speechless. In the weeks since Abram's accident, she had seen glimpses of the man he was becoming, but this act of compassion felt profound. Finally, she nodded, gratitude and relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Abram simply nodded, watching as she hurried out the door. For the first time, he felt the faint stirrings of a purpose beyond the confines of his company, a purpose rooted in connection, in humanity. Yet even as he took on the responsibility of managing without Alora, the lingering shadow of the mysterious phone call from the previous day reminded him that the challenges ahead were far from over. As the day unfolded, Abram found himself navigating the mansion's routine without Alora's steadying presence. The absence felt sharper than he anticipated. Her absence was a reminder of how much he had come to rely on her quiet guidance in a world that still felt foreign. Despite the growing unease from the cryptic phone call the day before, Abram threw himself into tasks, determined to keep his mind occupied. Meanwhile, back at her apartment, Alora sat at Eric's bedside, her heart heavy as she watched him sleep fitfully. The fever hadn't broken, and though Maria's remedies had offered some relief, Alora couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her. Eric's shallow breaths and occasional whimpers cut through her resolve, each one reminding her of how fragile her world truly was. When Maria gently suggested a visit to the clinic, Alora hesitated. The medical bills would be another burden on top of an already precarious financial situation. Still, the sight of Eric's flushed cheeks and the heat radiating from his small body pushed her to act. By late afternoon, Alora bundled Eric into her car and drove to the local clinic. The waiting room was a stark contrast to the opulence of the Whitmore mansion. Its worn chairs and buzzing fluorescent lights underscored the challenges faced by families like hers. Despite her anxiety, Alora held Eric's hand tightly, offering soft reassurances until a nurse called them in. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, examined Eric carefully. "It's a viral infection," she explained after a thorough checkup. "Nothing serious, but he's dehydrated and needs rest. We'll administer fluids here and send you home with medication." Relief washed over Alora, though it was tempered by the knowledge of how much even a minor medical visit would cost. She nodded, focusing on Eric's needs and ignoring the nagging thoughts about her next paycheck. While Alora and Eric remained at the clinic, Abram decided to take a walk through the mansion's grounds. The fresh air and sprawling gardens provided a rare moment of clarity, yet his thoughts continually returned to Alora. The memory of her strained expression tugged at him. For all his wealth and power, he felt powerless to ease her burden. As he reached the edge of the property, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Expecting another cryptic call, Abram hesitated before answering. To his surprise, it was Alora. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice steadier than he expected, "I just wanted to let you know that Eric's doing better. The clinic said it's nothing serious, just a viral infection." "That's good to hear," Abram replied, his tone softening. "Do you need anything? Medicine? Supplies?" "No, thank you," she said, though he could hear the exhaustion beneath her words. "I just, wanted to let you know, and to thank you again for letting me leave." Abram paused, a rare vulnerability slipping into his voice. "You don't need to thank me, Alora. If there's anything I can do, just ask." Alora hesitated, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. "I appreciate that," she said finally. "Really." As they ended the call, Abram felt a surprising sense of satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had made a meaningful difference, however small. But even as he found solace in the connection with Alora, the ever-present shadow of his company's turmoil loomed. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the events unfolding around him were part of a larger storm yet to come. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Whitmore mansion, casting long golden beams across the marble floors. Abram stood in the study, staring down at the bracelet on his wrist. It was simple, unassuming, and yet it seemed to carry a weight he couldn't quite understand. Gray had given it to him that morning, her expression as guarded as ever. "It was Father's," she had said, her voice cool but tinged with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. He always said it reminded him of what mattered. Abram had wanted to press her for more. What their father had meant, why she had chosen now to bring it up. But Gray had deflected, changing the subject as she always did when the conversation drifted too close to personal territory. Now, as he turned the bracelet over in his hands, he felt a pang of frustration. His memories remained maddeningly fragmented, and the few pieces he had managed to gather felt disconnected, like a puzzle with missing edges. The man he was before the accident seemed like a stranger, and the man he was becoming felt unfinished. The sound of heels clicking against the floor pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Gray entering the study, her tailored suit as impeccable as always. She carried a folder in one hand, her sharp gaze fixed on him. "Still brooding, I see," she said, her tone brisk. Abram raised an eyebrow. "Is there a reason you're here, Gray, or did you just come to critique my mood?" Gray smirked faintly, though her eyes softened. "I wanted to check on you, and to give you this." She placed the folder on the desk, tapping it once with her manicured fingers. "It's a report on some of Father's less public activities." Abram frowned, picking up the folder and flipping it open. Inside were pages of documents, financial records, correspondence, and photographs. As he skimmed through them, a pattern began to emerge. Their father had quietly funneled significant resources into charitable initiatives, many of which had supported underprivileged communities across Seattle. "This doesn't make sense," Abram said, his brow furrowing. "Father wasn't exactly known for his generosity." "He wasn't," Gray agreed, her voice quieter now. "But he believed in legacy, in building something that mattered, even if it wasn't visible to the world." Abram leaned against the desk, the weight of the revelations settling over him. "Why didn't I know about this?" "You were too focused on the business," Gray said bluntly. "And Father didn't want it to overshadow your work. He thought it was better this way." Abram closed the folder, his thoughts racing. The discovery added another layer to the man he had been and the man he might become. But it also raised questions about what he wanted to build moving forward. "I need time to think about this," he said finally, looking up at Gray. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Take all the time you need. Just remember, legacy isn't just about what you inherit. It's about what you leave behind." With that, she turned and left the room, leaving Abram alone with his thoughts and the quiet echoes of a past he was only beginning to uncover. Abram remained in the study for what felt like hours, the documents spread before him like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. His father's secret philanthropy wasn't just a revelation. It was a challenge. For years, Abram had prided himself on his sharp mind and business acumen, yet he had never once questioned the source of the company's quiet stability or the whispers of goodwill that occasionally reached him. Now, the question burned in his mind. Had his drive for success blinded him to the heart of what his father had built? The quiet knock at the door startled him. He looked up to see Alora standing there, her expression tentative but warm. In her hands was a tray with a steaming cup of tea. "I thought you might need this," she said softly, stepping into the room. Abram offered a faint smile as she set the tray on the desk. "Thank you," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his thoughts. Alora glanced at the open folder, her eyes flicking over the documents before meeting his gaze. "You've been in here a while. Is everything okay?" Abram hesitated, unsure how much to share, but something about Alora's steady presence made him feel safe, as if her strength could anchor him when his own faltered. "My sister brought me this," he said, gesturing to the papers. "It's about my father. He wasn't who I thought he was." Alora sat down in the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "What do you mean?" Abram sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He kept a lot of things hidden, charities, community projects, things that actually mattered. And I didn't see any of it. I was too focused on everything else." Alora tilted her head, studying him thoughtfully. "Maybe he wanted you to focus on the company, to build something strong enough to support those projects. It doesn't mean you failed him." Abram looked at her, surprised by the clarity of her perspective. "You're assuming he had that much faith in me," he said, his voice tinged with self-deprecation. "I don't think someone like your father would do all this without believing in what you could do," Alora replied gently. "But maybe it's not about what he believed. Maybe it's about what you believe you can do now." Her words settled over him like a balm, soothing the restless churn of his thoughts. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the bracelet on his wrist. "I need to figure out what that looks like," he said, more to himself than to her. Alora smiled faintly. "You will. Just don't be afraid to ask for help." As she left him alone once more, Abram felt the stirrings of a new determination. His father's legacy was more than a series of charitable acts. It was a foundation, and it was up to him to decide how to build on it. But even as Abram resolved to move forward, the shadows of the present loomed large. In the back of his mind, Calvin Langston's schemes remained a persistent threat, and Abram knew that the next step in reclaiming his life and his company would require more than just reflection. It would demand action, and he was finally ready to take it. The boardroom was a hive of murmured conversations and shuffling papers as the members of Whitmore Technologies gathered for the emergency meeting Calvin Langston had orchestrated. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settled in when power was at stake and alliances were uncertain. Calvin stood near the head of the table, his posture confident, exuding the authority of someone who believed he was about to win a crucial battle. Abram entered the room moments later, his presence commanding immediate attention. The quiet conversations stilled as all eyes turned to him. Despite the turmoil inside him, Abram carried himself with an air of calm authority that belied his fractured memories. He had spent the last few days piecing together what he could, and while the full picture still eluded him, he knew enough to recognize the stakes of the moment. "Good morning," Calvin said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I appreciate everyone's prompt attendance. This meeting is critical to ensuring the stability and future of Whitmore Technologies." Abram took his seat at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable. "Stability," he echoed, his voice measured. "I'm curious, Calvin, how you define that." Calvin's smile tightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features before he masked it. "As I'm sure you're aware, recent events have created uncertainty regarding leadership. While I sympathize with the challenges you've faced, Abram, the board has a duty to protect the company's interests." "And you believe that means replacing me," Abram said evenly, leaning back in his chair. His tone wasn't confrontational, but it carried enough weight to command attention. "It's not about replacement," Calvin countered, his voice honeyed with feigned concern. "It's about ensuring continuity. An interim leadership structure would allow you the time you need to recover fully while keeping the company on stable footing." The tension in the room deepened, board members exchanging glances as they gauged the unfolding dynamics. Abram let the silence linger, studying each face in turn before finally speaking. "Continuity is important," he acknowledged, his voice steady. "But so is trust. And I trust this board to understand what's really happening here." Calvin's jaw tightened again, his composure slipping ever so slightly. "This isn't personal, Abram. It's about what's best for the company." "Interesting," Abram said, his gaze sharpening, "because it feels very personal to me." Before Calvin could respond, the door to the boardroom opened, and Ella Carter stepped in. She carried a folder, her expression resolute despite the weight of the moment. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice clear, "but I have something the board needs to see." All eyes turned to her, and Calvin's mask of composure cracked just enough for Abram to notice. Ella walked to Abram and handed him the folder. "This contains evidence of questionable activities that I believe are relevant to today's discussion," she said. Abram opened the folder and began flipping through its contents. Emails, financial records, and notes detailing Calvin's secret meetings and attempts to consolidate power. The pieces fell into place, confirming what Abram had suspected but hadn't been able to prove. He looked up, his grey eyes locking with Calvin's. "Care to explain this, Calvin?" The room fell into a stunned silence, the weight of the evidence hanging heavy as Calvin struggled to form a response. Abram's confidence, bolstered by Ella's intervention, began to solidify. The tide of the meeting was shifting, and for the first time, Calvin's grip on the narrative seemed to falter. Calvin's lips parted, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. His polished demeanor wavered, and a sheen of perspiration appeared on his brow as the board members leaned in, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. "This is ridiculous," Calvin finally sputtered, his voice lacking its usual smoothness. "Whatever those documents are, they've been misinterpreted, taken out of context." "Context?" Abram echoed, his voice cool, deliberate. He stood, holding the folder in one hand. "Let me provide some context, then." He turned to the board, meeting each member's gaze. "These documents detail unauthorized meetings with our rival Harper Innovations, in which Calvin pushed for a merger that would compromise the integrity of Whitmore Technologies. They also outline his efforts to undermine my leadership by secretly consolidating votes among this board." The room erupted into murmurs, board members whispering to one another as they processed the revelations. Calvin raised his hands, his voice rising in desperation. "This is absurd. I acted in the best interest of the company, especially with Abram's condition throwing everything into uncertainty." Abram's jaw tightened, but he refused to let Calvin's words rattle him. "The best interest of the company? Or your own ambitions?" He placed the folder on the table, spreading the documents for all to see. "These actions don't reflect concern for stability. They reflect a calculated effort to seize control." One of the senior board members, a woman named Margaret, picked up one of the papers, her brow furrowing as she read. "These numbers, they show a deliberate attempt to devalue the company's core assets before a potential merger. Why wasn't this disclosed to the board?" Calvin stammered, searching for an answer, but his silence spoke louder than words. The board members turned their attention back to Abram, who took a steadying breath before continuing. "I've been recovering from more than just a physical injury," Abram said, his voice carrying a rare note of vulnerability. "I've been piecing together who I was, who I am now, and what this company stands for. Whitmore Technologies isn't just about profits. It's about innovation, integrity, and the people who make it what it is." His gaze swept the room, lingering on each member. "You all trusted me to lead this company. I won't pretend I have all the answers right now, but I can promise you this. I will fight for this company, for its employees, and for its future." The murmurs in the room shifted, the tone becoming one of agreement. Calvin's panic became palpable as the tide turned against him. "You're making a mistake," Calvin hissed, his desperation bubbling to the surface. "If you think you can handle this alone, you're more delusional than I thought." "I'm not alone," Abram said calmly, glancing at Ella, whose courage had tipped the scales. "And that's the difference." Margaret cleared her throat, silencing the room. "I think it's time we vote. The evidence speaks for itself." One by one, the board members voiced their support for Abram, their confidence in him growing with each declaration. Calvin sank into his chair, defeated, as the final vote sealed his fate. Abram's leadership was reaffirmed, and Calvin's position was terminated effective immediately. As the meeting adjourned, Abram remained seated, letting the gravity of the moment wash over him. Ella se acercó, su expresión una mezcla de orgullo y alivio. "I'm glad I could help," she said quietly. "You did more than help," Abram replied, his gratitude evident. "You reminded me what it means to trust and to lead." But even as he left the boardroom victorious, Abram knew the battle wasn't over. Calvin might have been ousted, but the challenges ahead, both within the company and beyond, would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The path forward was uncertain, but for the first time, Abram felt ready to face it. The days following the board meeting were a whirlwind of activity for Abram. Calvan's ousting had created a power vacuum, and Abram was determined to fill it with a renewed sense of purpose and vision. He spent long hours reviewing the company's operations, meeting with department heads, and rebuilding trust among the leadership team. Yet, amidst the progress, an undercurrent of unease remained. Corey Harper, the CEO of Harper Innovations, had been conspicuously quiet since the confrontation, and Abram couldn't shake the feeling that she was planning her next move. One afternoon, as Abram sat in his office reviewing projections for the upcoming quarter, his assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. Corey Harper is here to see you," Sheila announced, her voice tinged with tension. Abram set down his pen, his expression unreadable. "Send her in." Corey entered the room with her usual poise, her tailored suit immaculate, and her demeanor calm yet calculating. She offered a polite smile as she took the seat opposite Abram's desk. "Abram," she began, her tone smooth, "I thought it was time we had a proper conversation." Abram leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "I'm surprised you waited this long." "I wanted to let the dust settle," Corey replied, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I heard about Calvin. Bold move, cutting him loose." "It wasn't bold," Abram said evenly. "It was necessary." Corey nodded, her smile faint. "Fair enough. But with Calvin gone, I imagine you're re-evaluating the merger." Abram's eyes narrowed slightly. "I am. The question is, why are you here? To renegotiate, or to pressure me into a decision?" "Neither," Corey said, leaning forward slightly. "I came to offer clarity. The merger isn't just about profit margins or market share, it's about innovation. Harper Innovations and Whitmore Technologies have complementary strengths. Together, we could create something extraordinary." "Extraordinary for whom?" Abram asked, his voice sharp. "Your shareholders or mine?" "For both," Corey replied without missing a beat. "But more importantly, for the industry. We're on the brink of breakthroughs that could change lives. Clean energy solutions, advanced AI applications. You know as well as I do that the resources required to make those leaps are immense. A merger would give us the scale to make it happen." Abram studied her, searching for cracks in her polished exterior, but found none. Corey Harper was nothing if not convincing, and she spoke with the conviction of someone who believed in her own vision. Still, his instincts warned him to tread carefully. "I'll consider your proposal," Abram said finally, his tone measured. "But understand this. Whitmore Technologies won't sacrifice its integrity for anyone's vision, no matter how grand it sounds." Corey's smile widened slightly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Abram. I'll leave you to think it over." As she stood to leave, Abram felt a flicker of unease. Corey Harper was a formidable opponent, and he couldn't shake the feeling that her visit was only the first move in a much larger game. As the door clicked shut behind Corey, Abram exhaled slowly, the tension lingering in the room like an unwelcome guest. He knew better than to trust her smooth words and polished demeanor. Corey Harper wasn't here to collaborate. She was here to position herself advantageously, no matter the cost, to Whitmore Technologies. Abram's thoughts were interrupted by a message from Ella, his newly appointed assistant, who had proven herself invaluable since the board meeting. The message was brief but urgent. "We've uncovered a pattern in Harper Innovations' financial activities. You need to see this immediately." Minutes later, Ella entered his office with Kai Mitchell, the private security consultant who had been quietly assisting Abram since Calvin's schemes began to unravel. Ella handed Abram a tablet, her expression serious. "This just came in from one of our contacts in Harper Innovations' supply chain," she explained. It appears they've been aggressively acquiring patents and resources related to renewable energy, far beyond what's typical for a company of their size. Abram frowned as he reviewed the data. Are they consolidating to force our hand in the merger? It's possible, Kai interjected, his voice steady. But there's more. Several of the acquisitions overlap with projects Whitmore Technologies has in development. If Harper moves forward without us, they could corner the market on key innovations. Abram's grip on the tablet tightened. So, Corey's vision of collaboration is really just a strategy for domination. Ella Asintio. It gets worse. Some of these acquisitions are being funneled through shell companies. If we can trace the money trail, we might find evidence of insider dealing, or worse. Abram's jaw set, the weight of the revelation sinking in. And if we don't act quickly, we'll lose our competitive edge and our leverage in any negotiations. Kai stepped forward, his tone firm. What's the play, Abram? Do we confront Corey directly, or do we take this to the board and the press? Abram leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Confronting Corey risked escalating the situation prematurely, but waiting too long could leave Whitmore Technologies exposed. He needed a strategy that balanced offense and defense, a way to protect his company while gathering the evidence necessary to hold Corey accountable. We'll start by digging deeper, Abram decided. Kai, I want you to assemble a team to trace those shell companies and find out exactly how far this goes. Ella, coordinate with our legal department. If Harper Innovations is breaking any laws, I want to know before Corey makes her next move. And the merger? Ella asked. Abram hesitated, then shook his head. It's on hold. Corey's playing a long game, and we're not stepping into it blind. As the meeting ended, and Ella and Kai left to carry out their tasks, Abram stood by the window, staring out at the Seattle skyline. The stakes were higher than ever, and the lines between allies and enemies had never been more blurred. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now, when the future of Whitmore Technologies and the legacy he was just beginning to understand hung in the balance. But as the city lights flickered against the encroaching dusk, Abram felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He was no longer the man who let others define his path. He would protect his company, his people, and the vision he was finally beginning to see clearly, even if it meant facing Corey Harper head-on. The Whitmore mansion was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that pressed on Abram like an invisible weight. He stood in the study, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. In his hands, he held his father's journal, the worn leather cover cool against his fingertips. Gray had given it to him earlier in the day, her voice uncharacteristically tender as she explained its significance. He wrote this during the last years of his life, Gray had said, her expression guarded. He didn't share it with anyone. Not even me, but I think it's time you read it. Now, as Abram opened the journal, the faint scent of aged paper filled the air. His father's handwriting was precise, each word carefully chosen. The entries started as reflections on business strategies and the challenges of running Whitmore Technologies, but as Abram turned the pages, the tone shifted. His father wrote of regret, of missed opportunities to connect with his children, and of a desire to leave behind more than just financial success. Abram's chest tightened as he read a passage that seemed to leap off the page. The projects we fund in secret, these are my attempt to balance the scales. But it's not enough. Legacy isn't just about wealth or innovation, it's about people. I fear Abram doesn't see that yet, but maybe one day he will. The words hit Abram like a tidal wave, each line a mirror reflecting the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. He closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. His father's vision had been clear, to build something that mattered, not just in profit, but in purpose. And yet, Abram couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of what his father had truly intended. The soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Alora stepped inside, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, her voice low. "But you've been in here all evening." Abram managed a faint smile. "It's fine. I needed the time." Alora glanced at the journal in his hands, her brows furrowing slightly. "Is that—" "My father's journal," Abram confirmed. "Gray gave it to me. It's eye-opening, to say the least." Alora stepped closer, her gaze searching his face. "Do you want to talk about it?" Abram hesitated, the vulnerability of the moment pressing against his carefully maintained walls. But as he looked at Alora, he saw the same quiet strength that had drawn him to her from the start. She wasn't just a confidant. She was becoming an anchor in the storm of his rediscovery. "He wasn't who I thought he was," Abram admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "He cared about more than just the company. He wanted to leave behind something meaningful, something that lasted. And I don't know if I've lived up to that." Alora placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "You're starting to see it now," she said gently. "That's what matters. It's not about who you were. It's about who you're becoming." Her words settled over Abram like a soothing balm, and for the first time that night he felt a flicker of clarity amidst the chaos. But even as the pieces of his father's legacy began to fall into place, the shadows of the present loomed large. Corey Harper's maneuvers, the lingering fallout from Calvin's schemes, and the uncertainty of the future were all waiting just beyond the walls of the mansion. Abram exhaled slowly, setting the journal on the desk. "My father believed in something bigger than himself, but he didn't trust me enough to share it. He hid so much, these projects, his intentions, and now I'm left trying to piece it all together." Alora leaned against the desk, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe it wasn't about trust," she suggested. "Maybe he wanted you to find your own way, to discover this for yourself." Abram considered her words, the weight of them settling into his mind. "If that's true," he said, "then I need to make sure I don't waste this chance." Before Alora could respond, Gray appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed but her expression less guarded than usual. "I thought you might still be here," she said, stepping into the room. "I figured you'd need more answers." Abram gestured for her to join them, his curiosity piqued. "You've been holding out on me, haven't you?" Gray smirked faintly, a rare glimmer of amusement in her sharp gaze. "Let's just say Father didn't make it easy to connect the dots. But I've spent years digging through his papers, his accounts, trying to understand why he did what he did." She pulled a slim envelope from her jacket pocket and handed it to Abram. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten note from their father, dated just months before his passing. "Gray, if you're reading this, I trust you'll know what to do. Abram has always been brilliant, but brilliance without grounding is like a ship without an anchor. Help him see what truly matters. And remember, this legacy isn't just his to carry, it's yours too." Gray's voice softened as Abram read the note. "I've spent a long time resenting him," she admitted, "for how he raised us, for how distant he was. But now I think he knew we'd figure it out. Together." Abram looked up, the note trembling slightly in his hands. "Together," he echoed, the word carrying a weight he hadn't fully grasped before. For all their differences, he and Gray were the two halves of their father's vision, and it was up to them to honor it. Alora, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "This is your chance," she said, her voice steady. "Not just to understand him, but to build something better, something he would have been proud of." Abram nodded, the resolve in his chest hardening into something stronger. You're right. This isn't just about him, it's about the future. Gray straightened, her usual sharpness returning. Then we'd better get to work. Corey Harper isn't going to wait for us to sort out our family issues. Abram smirked faintly. No, she won't. But she's not going to see us coming either. As the three of them began mapping out their next steps, Abram felt the first stirrings of a new chapter, one rooted not in the shadow of his father's legacy, but in the shared purpose of those standing with him. Yet even as the pieces of the puzzle began to align, the challenges ahead loomed larger than ever, with Corey Harper's ambitions and the weight of the company's future pressing closer by the hour. The Whitmore Technologies conference room buzzed with quiet anticipation as employees gathered for an all-hands meeting, their faces a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. Abram stood near the front, flanked by Gray and Ella, each playing a pivotal role in the strategy he was about to unveil. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a statement of intent, a chance to redefine the company's future. Abram glanced at Gray, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and addressed the room. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady, but carrying an undertone of determination. "As you know, Whitmore Technologies has faced significant challenges in recent months, but those challenges have given us an opportunity to refocus on what matters most." He paused, scanning the room to ensure his words landed. This company was built on innovation, on pushing boundaries and creating solutions that change lives. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of the bigger picture. Today, that changes. Behind him, Ella clicked a button on the projector, displaying a sleek presentation slide with the words, "The Whitmore Initiative, Building a Sustainable Future." Abram continued, his voice gaining momentum. The Whitmore Initiative isn't just about profits or market share. It's about responsibility to our employees, to our community, and to the world. Our focus moving forward will be on sustainability, ethical innovation, and creating technologies that leave a positive impact. The room stirred with murmurs, employees exchanging glances as Abram laid out his vision. He gestured to Ella, who stepped forward to elaborate on the specific programs included in the initiative. From renewable energy projects to partnerships with local communities for workforce development, the plan was ambitious but grounded in tangible goals. Gray followed, her sharp insights cutting through the room's tension. "This isn't just a rebrand," she said firmly. "It's a realignment of our priorities, and it's not optional. The market is changing, and so must we." As Gray spoke, Abram's eyes scanned the crowd. He noticed a mix of reactions. Some employees nodding in agreement, others frowning with skepticism. The initiative was a bold move, and he knew it wouldn't win everyone over immediately. But the spark of hope in the room was undeniable, and that was enough to keep him pushing forward. When Gray finished, Abram took the floor again. "I know this won't be easy," he admitted, his tone honest. "Change never is. But I believe in this company, and in all of you. Together, we can build something that lasts, something we can all be proud of." The room erupted into applause, a ripple of energy that seemed to rejuvenate everyone present. As the meeting concluded, employees began to file out, their chatter filled with cautious excitement about the future. Abram lingered behind, watching as Ella and Gray exchanged notes on the next steps. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of direction, a purpose that extended beyond himself. Yet, in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the awareness that Corey Harper would see this as a direct challenge, and she wouldn't back down without a fight. As the last of the employees left the conference room, Abram turned to Gray and Ella, his expression serious. That went better than I expected, he admitted, though the weight of what lay ahead was clear in his tone. It's a strong start, Gray replied, gathering her notes. But we're not out of the woods yet. Corey Harper isn't just going to sit back and watch us shift the narrative. She'll have her next move ready. Ella nodded, her sharp eyes narrowing. We've already seen how aggressive she can be if she's funneling resources into renewable energy and overlapping with our projects. She'll see the Whitmore initiative as a direct threat. Abram leaned against the edge of the table, his mind working through the layers of strategy needed to stay ahead. Then, we need to make our next move before she does, he said firmly. Ella, I want you to spearhead the outreach to our potential partners. Start with local organizations, something that reinforces our commitment to the community. Ella nodded, already making notes on her tablet. I'll have a list of potential partners ready by the end of the day. Abram turned to Gray. What's the latest on Corey's financial activities? Has Kai uncovered anything new? Not yet, Gray admitted, her tone clipped. But he's digging into her shell companies. If there's anything shady going on, he'll find it. Abram's jaw tightened. Good. The moment we have something concrete, we take it to the legal team. If she's cutting corners or violating regulations, we'll use that to force her hand. Gray smirked faintly, a glimmer of satisfaction in her sharp gaze. It's about time we played offense. As they finalized their next steps, Abram's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his stomach sinking when he saw the name flashing across it. Corey Harper. He answered after a moment's hesitation, his voice steady. Corey. Abram, Corey said, her tone deceptively pleasant. I just wanted to congratulate you on your presentation today, the Whitmore initiative. Very ambitious. Abram's grip on the phone tightened, his instincts telling him there was more to her call than congratulations. Thank you, he replied cautiously. I'm glad you approve. Oh, I wouldn't say I approve, Corey said, a hint of steel creeping into her voice. But I do admire your timing, bold, unveiling such a strategy right now. Bold moves are what keep us ahead, Abram countered, his tone cool. Something I'm sure you understand. Corey chuckled, a sound that carried more menace than amusement. Indeed. But I'd be careful, Abram. Ambition without caution can lead to dangerous consequences. Abram's heart quickened, though he kept his voice steady. Is that a warning? Just a friendly piece of advice, Corey replied smoothly. I look forward to seeing how this plays out. Good luck, Abram. You're going to need it. The line went dead, leaving Abram gripping the phone, his thoughts racing. He looked up at Gray and Ella, who had been watching him closely. She knows, Abram said quietly. About everything. Gray's expression hardened. Then we'd better be ready. Whatever she's planning, it's coming soon. Ella straightened, her determination evident. Let her try. We're not backing down. Abram nodded, his resolve solidifying. The Whitmore initiative was more than just a strategy. It was a declaration of his vision, his commitment to a better future. But as Corey's shadow loomed larger, he knew the battle for that future was only just beginning. The boardroom buzzed with anticipation, the air charged with an unspoken tension. Abram sat at the head of the table, his expression calm but his mind racing. He had spent the past few days preparing for this moment, knowing it would be a pivotal battle in the fight for Whitmore Technology's future. Around him, the board members exchanged quiet murmurs, their eyes darting between one another as they tried to predict the outcome of the day's meeting. At the far end of the table, Corey Harper sat with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Her tailored suit and composed demeanor projected authority, but Abram could see the subtle tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers tapped against the armrest of her chair. She was calculating her next move, just as he was. The meeting began with routine reports, a thin veil of normalcy over the storm brewing beneath. When it came time to discuss the merger, Corey leaned forward, her voice smooth and deliberate. As you all know, Harper Innovations has proposed a merger that would not only stabilize our two companies, but also position us as leaders in renewable energy and advanced technologies. This is an opportunity we can't afford to ignore. Abram let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. Opportunity is a matter of perspective, he said, his tone measured. What you call stability, I call compromise. Whitmore Technologies has always been a leader in innovation, on our terms. A merger like this would dilute our vision and jeopardize the very identity that makes us successful. Corey's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained cold. You speak of identity, but let's not forget the challenges your company has faced recently. Leadership instability, market volatility. These are not small issues, Abram. My proposal offers a solution. A solution for whom? Abram countered, his voice firm. Your shareholders? Your expansion plans? Whitmore Technologies doesn't need to be saved, Corey. We need to be strengthened, and that doesn't happen by handing over control. The tension in the room thickened, the board members leaning forward as the exchange unfolded. Corey's composure slipped ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing. You're letting pride cloud your judgment, she said, her tone sharp. This isn't about control, it's about survival. Survival isn't about surrendering our values, Abram shot back, his voice rising slightly. It's about adapting, innovating, and leading. And that's exactly what the Whitmore Initiative is designed to do. At his cue, Ella stood and distributed folders to the board members, each containing detailed plans and projections for the initiative. As the members flipped through the pages, murmurs of surprise and interest filled the room. Corey's expression darkened, a flicker of frustration breaking through her polished facade. This initiative represents our commitment to sustainable growth and ethical innovation, Abram continued. It's not just a strategy, it's a vision for the future, one that puts our employees, our communities, and our values first. Corey leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as she regarded him. It's ambitious, she admitted, but ambition without resources is just a dream. Can you deliver on this, Abram? Or are you selling them a fantasy? Abram met her gaze head-on, his resolve unshakable. We'll deliver, he said firmly, because this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. And together, we're stronger than you think. The room fell into silence, the weight of his words lingering as the board members processed the unfolding drama. Abram knew the battle wasn't over, but he could see the cracks forming in Corey's confidence. The tide was shifting, and the stakes had never been higher. Corey's icy demeanor faltered as the board members exchanged glances, their whispered conversations a clear indication that Abram's argument was resonating. She straightened in her chair, her sharp eyes scanning the room, searching for an ally to turn the tide back in her favor. Margaret, one of the longest-serving board members, cleared her throat, breaking the tension. Abram, she began, her voice steady but probing, the Whitmore Initiative is bold, but it requires significant resources and unwavering commitment. How can you ensure that this vision won't overextend the company? Abram nodded, acknowledging her concern. That's a valid question, Margaret. The initiative has been carefully planned to balance immediate impact with long-term sustainability. Our projections show that initial investments in renewable energy and ethical innovation will not only enhance our reputation, but also position us as industry leaders in sectors that are growing rapidly. He gestured toward Ella, who stood beside the presentation screen, ready to elaborate. Ella, can you walk us through the numbers? Ella stepped forward, her confidence evident as she flipped to a detailed slide displaying financial projections. The first phase of the initiative focuses on partnerships with local organizations, which reduces upfront costs while fostering goodwill in the community. By reallocating funds from non-essential projects and leveraging our existing infrastructure, we can achieve significant milestones without jeopardizing current operations. As Ella spoke, the board members leaned in, studying the charts and figures displayed on the screen. Even those who had seemed skeptical at the start were beginning to nod in agreement. Corey, however, wasn't ready to concede. "And what happens when unforeseen challenges arise?" she interjected, her voice cool but pointed. "This industry is volatile. One misstep, and your initiative could collapse, taking the company down with it." Abram turned to her, his gaze steady. "Every strategy carries risks, Corey, but I'd rather take calculated risks that align with our values than gamble the company's future on a merger that undermines everything we stand for." His words hung in the air, and the tension in the room reached its peak. Corey's carefully constructed composure cracked, and for the first time, she looked genuinely unsettled. Abram seized the moment, turning back to the board. "This decision isn't just about numbers or projections," he said, his voice strong and clear. "It's about who we are as a company and who we want to become. Whitmore Technologies was built on a foundation of innovation, integrity, and resilience. We don't need to merge to thrive. We need to believe in ourselves and the people who make this company what it is." The room erupted into quiet applause, a ripple of support that sent a clear message. The board was aligning with Abram's vision, and Corey Harper's influence was waning. She sat back in her chair, her expression hardening as the realization set in. Margaret raised her hand, silencing the room. "I believe it's time we vote," she said. "The question before us is clear. Do we proceed with the merger, or do we move forward with Abram's leadership and the Whitmore Initiative?" One by one, the board members cast their votes, their decisions reflecting the shifting tides of the room. When the final tally was announced, the decision was unanimous. The merger was rejected, and Abram's vision for the company was affirmed. Corey stood, her expression unreadable as she gathered her belongings. "Well played, Abram," she said, her tone cold but tinged with reluctant respect. "This isn't over." "I wouldn't expect it to be," Abram replied evenly, watching as she exited the room. As the board members began to disperse, Abram remained at the table, a quiet sense of triumph settling over him. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The challenges ahead were daunting, but for the first time, he felt truly ready to face them. With the support of his team and the strength of his newfound purpose, he was determined to lead Whitmore Technologies into a future that honored its past while embracing the possibilities of what lay ahead. The sun cast a warm glow over the sprawling gardens of the Whitmore estate, the golden light filtering through the tall trees and illuminating the path where Abram walked. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter, the weight of uncertainty that had pressed on him finally beginning to lift. The events of the past weeks had tested him in ways he never anticipated, but they had also reshaped him, revealing a man he was just beginning to understand. Abram paused by the fountain, the gentle trickle of water a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. The Whitmore Initiative was officially underway, its ambitious plans already drawing attention from industry leaders and the press. The decision to reject the merger with Harper Innovations had been met with mixed reactions in the business world, but Abram's resolve had only grown stronger. This was his company's path, a legacy rooted in integrity, not compromise. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of footsteps. Turning, he saw Alora approaching, her expression warm but curious. She held a folder in her hands, a sign that even amidst this newfound calm, Work was never far away. "Busy day?" she asked as she joined him by the fountain. Abram smiled faintly, gesturing to the gardens around them. "Busier than I'd like, but that's nothing new." Alora tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "You look different," she said finally. "More at peace." He chuckled softly, the sound carrying a mix of relief and reflection. "Maybe I am. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm building something that matters, not just for the company, but for the people who depend on it." Alora nodded, her gaze dropping briefly to the folder in her hands. "Speaking of building something, there's a proposal in here I think you'll like. It's about expanding the community outreach programs under the initiative." Abram took the folder, flipping through the pages. As he scanned the details, he felt a swell of pride, not just in the plans outlined before him, but in the team that had made them possible. Alora, Gray, Ella, and even Kai had become more than just colleagues or allies. They were a family of sorts, united by a shared vision. "This is good," he said, closing the folder and looking at Alora. "Really good." She smiled, a flicker of something deeper in her expression. "I'm glad you think so. I wasn't sure if it was too ambitious." "Ambition is what got us here," Abram replied, his tone firm but kind. "And it's what's going to keep us moving forward." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the connection between them unspoken but undeniable. Abram glanced back toward the house, where Gray was likely finalizing plans for an upcoming investor meeting, and Ella was working on the next phase of the initiative. Each of them had found their place in this new chapter, just as he had. Yet, amidst the progress and plans, Abram couldn't ignore the other changes taking root, not just in the company, but in his heart. And as he looked at Alora, he realized that the foundation of his new life wasn't just built on vision and strategy. It was built on the people who had helped him rediscover himself. Abram turned back to Alora, the weight of the moment settling between them. The journey they had shared, from the chaos of his accident to the triumphs and trials of the past months, had formed a bond neither of them had anticipated. He opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by the sound of laughter from the far side of the garden. They both turned to see Eric running toward them, his small frame bouncing with excitement. Gray followed a few steps behind, her typically reserved expression softened by the boy's unbridled energy. Eric stopped in front of them, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers he had plucked from the edge of the property. "For you, Mr. Whitmore," Eric declared, holding the flowers out proudly. Abram crouched to take the bouquet, his smile widening. "Thank you, Eric. These are perfect." "Mum says you like flowers," Eric added, glancing at Alora with the innocent confidence only a child could possess. "And she says you're her favorite boss ever." Alora's cheeks flushed, and she shook her head with a laugh. "Eric, I didn't say that." "But you smiled when you talked about him," Eric countered, grinning mischievously. Gray chuckled, stepping closer as Abram straightened. "Out of the mouths of babes," she remarked dryly, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. The moment felt light, yet it carried a depth Abram couldn't ignore. He looked at Gray, whose own journey had brought them closer as siblings. The journal their father had left behind was no longer just a relic of the past. It was a guide that had helped them both find clarity. Together, they had embraced a vision that honored their family's legacy while forging a future of their own design. Abram's gaze shifted back to Alora, and he realized he was no longer looking at just an employee or an ally. She was the person who had been there when he was at his lowest, the one who had reminded him of his humanity when he had almost lost it entirely. The realization settled over him like a sunrise, gentle yet undeniable. "Alora," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling within him. There's something I've been meaning to say. She looked at him, her expression curious but cautious. What is it? Abram hesitated, not out of fear but to savor the gravity of the moment. You've been more than just someone who helped me find my way back. You've been my compass, my anchor. And I don't think I'd be standing here, ready to face what's ahead, without you. Alora blinked, the warmth in her eyes betraying the emotions she tried to keep contained. Before she could finish, Abram reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. The simple gesture drew a gasp from Gray and a wide-eyed stare from Eric, who immediately tugged on his mother's sleeve. "What is that, Mom?" Eric whispered loudly, making everyone laugh. Abram dropped to one knee, holding the box open to reveal a delicate ring. "Alora Flores, you've shown me the meaning of resilience, kindness, and love. Will you do me the honor of building this future together, as my partner in every way?" Tears brimmed in Alora's eyes, her hand flying to her mouth as she nodded, unable to speak. Finally, she found her voice. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Abram." Of course. The garden seemed to come alive with applause and laughter as Gray clapped her hands and Eric jumped up and down, cheering. Abram stood, sliding the ring onto Alora's finger before pulling her into a tender embrace. For the first time in months, he felt a profound sense of completeness, not just in his company, but in his life. As they all walked back to the mansion together, Abram couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The challenges hadn't disappeared, and Corey Harper still loomed as a rival, but for the first time, he faced the future with a clarity and confidence that felt unshakable. Whitmore Technologies would thrive, not because of mergers or market strategies, but because of the people who believed in its purpose. And as Abram looked at Alora, Eric, and Gray beside him, he knew that the legacy he was building was one rooted in love, trust, and an unwavering commitment to the people who mattered most.